we'll click start here. Before we watch the video, any just initial questions or thoughts or wonderings on the book of Acts itself?
Who wrote it?
Who wrote it? And we'll get there.
Right.
Yeah. Luke, right? So Luke is the traditional author of Acts. Whoever we think of as having written Acts, it's certain that they also wrote the Gospel of Luke. So Acts is really just a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. Any other rapid fire questions or wonderings? Oh, it's beeping at me. Look at that guy. Okay. Oh yeah. Then I printed off this. It's like you said it was like a placemat or something. Like you're at Perkins.
Like I said, I'm having breakfast with Jesus.
That's true. Yeah. I wanted to find the biggest sheet of paper I could because sometimes the font gets so small and they're so intricate. So this is in a sense what the video will walk us through. So it's humongous. So I apologize for
I
that.
appreciate it.
Okay, I'm gonna hit play on this and see how loud it is.
That's for sure.
Let's
And
see,
then it's
online audience, here's your movie.
The Book of Acts. It's the second volume of a unified two-part work that today we call Luke Acts. These were written by the same author, Luke, who was a traveling co-worker with Paul. This is clear from the book's introduction, where Luke says, "I produced my first volume," that's the Gospel, "about all the things that Jesus began to do and to teach." Now Luke's giving a clue here as to what this book of Acts will be about. Volume 1 was about what Jesus began to do and to teach. Volume 2 will then be about what Jesus continued to do and teach. Which leads to a really interesting point about the book's traditional but not original name, the Acts of the Apostles. While different apostles do appear in most of these stories, the only single character who unifies the whole story from beginning to end is Jesus himself, acting directly or through the Spirit. And so the book would more accurately be named The Acts of Jesus and the Spirit. The book's introduction recounts how the risen Jesus spends some 40 days with the disciples, teaching them about the kingdom of God. This connects back to the story of Luke's Gospel, where Jesus claimed that he was restoring God's kingdom over the world, beginning with Israel. So he called Israel to live under God's reign by following him. And he was enthroned as king when he gave up his life and then conquered death with his love. And so the book of Acts begins with the risen King Jesus instructing his disciples about life in his kingdom. So he promises that the Spirit will soon come and immerse them in his personal presence. And this fulfills one of the key hopes from the Old Testament prophets, that in the Messianic kingdom, God's presence, his Spirit, would come and take up residence among his people in a new temple and transform their hearts. And so Jesus says, when this happens, the Spirit will empower his disciples to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. From here, Jesus is taken up from their sight in a cloud. It's an image drawn from the book of Daniel, chapter 7. It shows how Jesus is now being enthroned as the Son of Man who was vindicated after his suffering and now shares in God's rule over the world. And so he promises that he will return one day. And so the main themes and the design of the book of Acts flow right out of this opening chapter. This is a story about Jesus leading his people by the Spirit to go out into the world and invite all nations to live under his reign. And so the story will begin with that message spreading in Jerusalem and then into the neighboring regions of Judea and Samaria full of non-Jewish people, and then from there out to all of the nations into the ends of the earth. This video is just going to focus on the first half of the book. So the Jerusalem focus section begins with Jesus' followers waiting until the Feast of Pentecost, when all of these Jewish pilgrims from all over the ancient world were in the city. And the Holy Spirit comes on the disciples as a great wind, and something like flames appear over each person's head, and together they start announcing and telling stories of God's mighty deeds. And they're speaking in all of these languages that they didn't know before, but all the people gathered there understand perfectly. Now, in order to see what Luke's emphasizing in this story, it's crucial to see the Old Testament roots of all of these images. So first, the wind and the fire is a direct allusion to the stories about God's glorious fiery presence filling the tabernacle and the temple. And it's also connected to the prophetic promises that God would come and live by his Spirit in the new temple of the Messianic kingdom. And so here in Acts, God's fiery presence comes to dwell not in a building, but in his people. Luke is saying that the new temple promised by the prophets is Jesus' new covenant family, the people of Jesus, which connects to the second thing Luke is trying to say here. So the prophets promised that when God came to dwell in his new temple, he would reunify all the tribes of Israel under the Messianic king, and that the good news of God's reign would go out and be announced to the nations. Luke describes in detail the international multi-tribe makeup of all of the Israelites who were there at Pentecost and who responded to Peter's message. And so the apostles keep calling Israelites to acknowledge Jesus as their Messiah, and thousands upon thousands respond, forming new communities of generosity and worship and celebration. But not everybody's celebrating. From here, Luke shows how Jesus' new family quickly faced hostility from the Jerusalem leaders. With a really beautiful symmetrical design, Luke tells a tale of two temples. So God's new temple, the community of Jesus' followers, they're gathering every day in the temple courts and from house to house. Now, in between those notices are two stories about Peter and the other apostles healing people in the temple courts, only to get arrested by the temple leaders, followed each time by a speech of Peter claiming that Jesus is the true king of Israel. And at the center of all this is a story about Jesus' followers donating property and possessions to a common fund to help the poor, which is really cool, but it seems kind of random for Luke to mention it here until you realize that this was a practice described in the laws of the Torah and was supposed to be happening through the Jerusalem temple and its leaders. So Luke's point here is clear. The new temple of Jesus' community is fulfilling the purpose that God always intended for the Jerusalem temple, to be a place where heaven and earth meet, where people encounter God's generosity and healing presence. And this conflict between the two temples, it culminates in Acts chapter 6 and 7. It's the first wave of persecution. So Jesus' followers, they continue to multiply, requiring more leaders. And one of these, Stephen, he's a bold witness for Jesus in Jerusalem. And he ends up getting arrested, and he's accused of speaking against and even threatening the temple. And so Stephen here gives a long speech showing how Israel's leaders have always rejected the messengers God sent them, including Jesus and now his disciples. So the Jerusalem leaders are enraged. They murder Stephen, and they launch a wave of persecution against Jesus' followers that drives most of them from the city. But it has a paradoxical effect. Luke shows how this tragedy actually became the means by which Jesus' people are now sent out into Judea and Samaria. Now, in this section, Luke has collected a diverse group of stories that all show how the mostly Jewish, Jerusalem-based community of Jesus became a multi-ethnic international movement. So first is the mission of Philip into Samaria. It's the land of Israel's hated enemies, and many of them come to follow Jesus. Next, we have the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul. He was the sworn enemy and persecutor of Jesus' followers until he personally met the risen Jesus, and he then became a passionate advocate on behalf of Jesus. Next is the story of Peter having a vision about how God doesn't consider non-Jewish people ritually impure or unworthy of joining Jesus' family. And so Peter, he's led by the Spirit into the house of a Roman soldier, full of non-Jewish people, and they all respond to the good news about Jesus. In fact, the Spirit shows up powerfully upon them, just as he did to the Jewish disciples back in chapter 2. These themes all come together in the founding of the church in Antioch, the largest, most cosmopolitan city in that part of the Roman Empire. And Luke, he tells us that Barnabas, a Jewish leader from the Jerusalem church, went along with Paul to help lead this church community. And so it became the first large multi-ethnic church in history. It was where Jesus' followers were called Christians for the first time, and it's from here that the first international missionaries were sent out. And so we see Jesus' commission coming true, and this takes us into the rest of Luke's story. But for now, That's the first half of the book of Acts. And this takes us into the rest of Luke's story. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Acts.
What? We didn't even get our popcorn. Just saying.
Well, if we have time, we'll watch part 2 so we can hear the whole story.
That was really good.
That's rapid fire, but any questions or thoughts on that? No? We're good? Okay. Open up, if you have a Bible in front of you, if you can, let's open up to the book of Acts. If anything, it's just good practice to figure out where some of these books are in the Bible. And then we'll get into our handout here too. So when you're staring at the very first verse in the book of Acts, you'll notice that it says, in the first book, Theophilus. I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach, etc. Right? So in the first book, maybe we've never noticed this before, but that first book is referencing back to the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. Because if you go back to, now let's page back to Luke's Gospel. So if you turn to Luke's Gospel, in my former book, we'd have to stare at the Greek to see it either way. First book, former book, the previous book. So if you go to Luke's Gospel, and if you go to the first verses here. So Luke starts off his gospel saying, since many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who were from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, this is the author, as one having a grasp of everything from the start, to write a well-ordered account for you, most excellent Theophilus, right? So there's that Theophilus showing up again.
Where are you?
I'm in Luke's gospel now.
Yep. Which one?
At the very start.
First verse.
Chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.
Thank you.
So Theophilus shows up in verse 3, and he's writing this so that he may have a firm grasp of the words in which you have been instructed. So Luke's gospel begins that way with this Theophilus figure showing up. And then when you're in, Theophilus is in verse 3 of chapter 1 of Luke. And then again in verse 1 of Acts, Theophilus is showing up. Are we seeing Theophilus in Luke 1, verse 1?
Yep, got it.
Perfect. So that's why we say when we go back to who wrote Acts, traditional inscription is that it's Luke himself, companion of Paul, that we'll meet and hear about not only in Acts, but we hear about him in Luke's letters too. But even if you want to say it's somebody else close to the apostles back in that time period, it's clear that whoever wrote Acts also wrote Luke's gospel.
Do we know how much time passed in between Luke and Acts that he would?
How much time passed?
Right, I mean, when he wrote Luke, and then when did he write Acts?
Oh, that's a good, yeah. So it's on the top of page 2 of your handout. Yep, so let's sneak over to the handout now.
I didn't do that.
No, you're good. So on the top of page 2, so when do we want to say that the book of Acts was written? You need to actually somewhat date when the book of Luke was written first, and then we can kind of figure out when Acts was written, because presumably Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke first, and then he wrote the book of Acts after that. I get a little leery when people really like narrowly date some of these texts, like within a 5-year window or a 10-year window. So I think I give us for the book of Acts, yeah, there's a lot of writing here, sorry about that. From the second to last paragraph, as far as dating when Acts was written, I give us a window from 60 AD to 100. AD. So about a 40-year window. So if we say that, right, so Jesus' ministry is happening in the early 30s. So the shortest amount of window potentially between when these events in Acts take place, or at least the early events in Acts take place, and when it was written is about 30 years. Or potentially if it's not written until the 90s, there's maybe a gap of 30 plus years. So middle to late first century, as to when Acts was written. We say that because there are events at the end of Acts that take place in the early 60s. So it can't necessarily been written before like 62 or 64 AD, because in chapter 24, Luke is recounting events that take place in the 60s. So we know we need to wait at least that amount of time for when it was written.
Okay, I have a question. I've asked this before.
Yep.
So I'll ask it again.
That's okay.
I always thought that AD after the death of Christ, but you told me no.
It's technically, I don't, my Latin is pretty poor. Anno Dominio something. It means in the year of our Lord.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So not after the death?
No, some people, yeah. I suppose you could
I was thinking that too.
you could have it be that, right? Because the letters match up.
You do.
But I want to be right.
You want to be right. So it's technically in the year of our Lord.
But
Okay.
it's more of the birth, not the death.
Correct, right? So even if we said after the death, yeah, it's technically marking from the birth of Jesus. And even then, the guy who made the system still messed it up by 4 or 6 years potentially too. So,
When people wrote books back then, were they intended to be copied and multiplied and, have like you do?
that's a
in
good
this
question.
book,
Yeah.
You do 20, 30, 50, 100, I don't know.
Mhm.
But back then, must have been intention that this is gonna be.
That's a good question. So you could argue, I suppose, when Paul writes his letters to individual churches, right, he's probably just writing one letter. It gets sent off to the churches of Corinth or Ephesus. Let's say there's maybe 3 or 4 church houses in Ephesus where there's Christians gathered, right? And let's say a letter shows up at one of their doorsteps and they say, hey, Kathy received a letter from Paul addressed to all the churches here in Corinth. Let's all get together at her house and someone's going to read this letter. Typically then someone helps interpret the letter. They probably frame the letter, right? They probably take good care of that letter. And then maybe it starts to get copied or multiplied out. For a book like Acts, though, it's not written to a community like that. It's potentially written just to one specific person, this individual named Theophilus. So let's say it's written to a guy named Theophilus. Maybe he gets, when you think about how big of that would have taken a lot of stamps for that to have gotten to Theophilus. He's getting Luke and Acts. That's like 20% of the New Testament, right? So the author of Luke and Acts writes a bunch of what eventually ends up being in the New Testament. So if it's just going to Theophilus, what a lucky guy that he got an entire gospel and the book of Acts, maybe addressed just to him. Maybe he receives that and says, hey, this has got to get out further than just me. And so then maybe scribes begin to, make copies. It gets disseminated out further. So certainly there was a practice of, scribes probably copying out these letters and these books and having them disseminate out further.
And aren't both of these books more historical in the sense of, instead of some of the other letters, guidance and so forth, Luke wanted to kind of put actual history down on paper.
Luke does. His gospel is more like Matthew and Mark, right? He tends to, if you go back to Luke's gospel, sorry, we don't open our Bibles that often in Bible study, so we could actually open them up for a change. Luke does center his writings more so in history than do, say, Mark and Matthew and John. So if you're in Luke chapter 1, I know, sorry, I'm bouncing you all over the place today. If you're in Luke chapter 1, in verse 5, and you don't have to always, I can just read these out too. In Luke 1, verse 5, it says, in the days of King Herod of Judea, right? So he's centering, he's pairing up a historical person with an event that he's relating about. And here it's John the Baptist's birth. Later in chapter 2, we get, right, the famous Christmas Eve reading where, again, he's centering a Jesus event, but he's anchoring it within, like, historical events. So in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, right? And he's mentioning Quirinius, governor of Syria. So once again, he's anchoring a Jesus event with real world history events too. So right, Luke has a tendency in a way that Mark, Matthew, and John don't, as he's telling the Jesus story, to kind of anchor it and show that it takes place within history. The book of Acts, normally if you categorize the New Testament books, right, the first four are typically called the Gospels, then we'll have letters of Paul, then maybe pastoral epistles, then you have Apocalypse with Revelation. Typically there's always a category of history, and it includes one book typically, if you kind of see a chart, and it'll be the book of Acts. Will get labeled as history. We'll talk a little bit about what kind of history are we looking at here. But yes, Acts certainly is more of the second half of Acts is certainly functions more like a travel log for where Paul is going. But even the first half of Acts is more or less a history of the early church, from when Jesus goes back into heaven to when Paul begins his mission.
What language would the letters have been written in?
They would have been written in Greek.
So I'm going to shorten his name because I can't say it. Was
Theophilus?
Theo?
Yeah.
Was he Greek? And is that the reason it was sent to him, is because they knew that he would be able to read it rather than having it interpreted?
Well, that's a good question. His name means potentially lover of God or one who loves God. So it's either an actual person, or if you take that name, the meaning of the name, like lover of God or one who loves God, maybe it's a group of people that love God, and it kind of has just gotten put into a name. Is it written to him because he could actually read it? That's a good question, maybe. Typically, like when Paul's letters get delivered, the person who carries the letter will be the person that reads it typically, and then will be the person that helps interpret it. So typically that's who's doing the reading and the interpreting for the people. Luke's gospel is thought to have been written to a bunch of non-Jewish folks, so more of a Gentile population, if you will, which then maybe is why we're getting this Greek-sounding name here, right? So it probably isn't surprising that if his general audience is more Greek-based and less kind of Jewish-based, that's potentially why we're seeing Theophilus show up as a name too, because that's just his audience. But potentially then he's able to actually read what Luke has put on paper too. We skipped over the end of page 1 of our intro. Title. Yeah, I forgot that the video says the title should be better called Acts of Jesus in the Spirit, I think is how it framed it.
Yeah.
Outside of the video, I'm not sure if I've ever heard that before. I don't mind it. I had a different suggestion. It happens in chapter 1, so you'll see that next week. What is this book called? Acts of the Apostles, I think, is like the first name that shows up in some of the oldest manuscripts that we can find. For the purpose of the study, we'll just call it Acts. We'll just shorten it down to Acts. Apostles yes, it talks about, so the apostles in a sense meaning the 12 disciples. Yes, they show up as a group, but really the first half of Acts is all about what Peter is doing. He's kind of the spokesperson for the 12 disciples. So really the first half of Acts is about Peter, and the second half of Acts is about Paul. So really, I think, I do like how the video says the common thread throughout is Jesus and the Spirit. Yes. But Acts of the Apostles really could be called Acts of Peter and Paul, I think.
What does apostle mean?
Apostle means one who is sent.
There's many names in Acts that of other quote unquote disciples that are named that are, is that where the Acts of the Apostles came from? I mean, because there's multiple more than just the two that you mentioned.
There's more than just the two. Luke reserves the title apostle for only the 12 disciples. I think only one time he slips up and calls Paul and Barnabas apostles, but typically he does not call them apostles. But the word apostle just means one who is sent, right? So I think we could all consider ourselves people who have been sent by, right? The Spirit, or sent by Jesus for particular missions and ministry out in the world. So although Luke reserves it for only the 12 disciples, I think we're fine to say, hey, we are all apostles, right? People who have been sent for particular things. Manuscripts, oldest complete manuscript over bottom of page 1 of the handout, dates to the 4th century. That's going to be pretty standard with all the books of the New Testament. There are fragments that take us back about 100 years prior to that. If you go all the way to the back page of the handout, this will be in black and white in the book, so you get a color version today. Here's a fragment, probably one of the oldest fragments of the book of Acts that's out there from about 250. So less than 200 years after Acts would have been written. That's about the approximate size, and this is about 10 verses from chapter 7. So when we say fragments, this is actually a pretty good sized fragment. Sometimes you only get like a sentence or two on these fragments. So this is what the Greek looks like, right? It's all capital letters. There's no punctuation. There's no spacing between the words. So it's a whole different way of reading for the Greek that they had back then.
I didn't know where one word ends
And the other begins. Yeah,
That's one big run-on sentence.
it is. It's just
Learn how to read Greek.
a run-on sentence.
So now we should cut this out and put it in the book so we've got the colored one.
You can do that if you like. Yes, feel free to deface anything that you like. That's up to you. Let's see. Let's go to the top of page 3. I made one of these little graphs again because you guys seem to like these little charts here. So here's a timeline. So let's just look at we've got, right, the year 30 on the far left. We've got the year 70 on the far right. So this is a pretty narrow window of time that we're looking at here. So starting on the far left, let's say Jesus, not only resurrection, but like entire ministry, right? If it's about 1 year long, is taking place. Let's just say it takes place in 33 AD for the sake of argument, right? So kind of right where it is on the chart there. Acts chapter 2 recounts the day of Pentecost. So again, Pentecost just means 50th. So it's just 50 days after Jesus' resurrection. So we've got Luke's gospel that takes us from before Jesus was born and gets us all the way to his ascension, which is 40 days after his resurrection. And then Acts basically just picks up right at that particular moment. So the book of Acts, right in chapters 1 and 2, starts in about the year 33 AD. Let's say Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. This happens in Acts chapter 9. That's also in the early 30s. And then he spends some time kind of in his home of Antioch, wandering around a little bit. It's not really for about a decade that he goes on his first kind of missionary trip. And if you have like a study Bible, typically toward the back, there will be maps. And typically there's always a map of Paul and his missionary journeys. Yes, the journeys of Paul as described in the Acts of the Apostles. And it's just, man, a whole bunch of lines that all get, they try and color coordinate them here, but it's not as easy to follow. Typically it's understood that he makes at least 3 journeys. We'll go with that for the purposes of our study. And so those take place, let's say, in the mid-40s all the way to the mid-50s. It ends with Paul being, yeah, there we go. Yeah, Connie's got one there in hers. There's lines all over the place. He's traveling all over the Eastern Mediterranean, somewhat to the Northern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, what is modern-day Greece and Turkey. A little bit of Syria in there as well. So he goes,
It's like he's doing a Viking river cruise or something. You know, those maps that they show. There you go.
river cruise. Yeah, well, it's all a river cruise until his final, so he gets imprisoned and put on trial in Jerusalem in the late 50s. And then he does eventually get up to the city of Rome where his trial is really held. That's less of a Viking river cruise. They get shipwrecked on their way up to Rome in chapter 27. And then Paul is eventually killed up in Rome in the mid to late 60s. Acts doesn't end telling us that information. So Acts ends telling us that Paul has been arrested. He's transported up to Jerusalem to await trial. He's on house arrest for a couple of years. He's preaching the gospel without hindrance in Rome, right? The city or the kind of the center of the Roman Empire. And here he is just without hindrance talking about Jesus. But it doesn't end with telling us that Paul has been killed, although it probably knows that information, right? It's most likely that Acts was written after the death of Paul, but it doesn't.
Why wouldn't he, if he knew that?
If
why
Luke
would
knows
he
that,
include it?
maybe he wants to end on a positive note, right? That is an open question. Why doesn't Luke tell us that Paul is killed?
Because that could date it pretty close. I mean, if he wasn't killed yet.
Well, it just tells us that it at least is written no earlier than like the early 60s, right? Which is kind of what we've already established. I think we'll establish that Luke's gospel was written sometime in like the 60s or 70s, so it gets hard to date Acts any earlier. But no, it doesn't tell us that Paul was killed, which is an open question, but I think it's so he can end on a positive
The temple destroyed.
note.
Similar thought then. He doesn't want to.
Why he doesn't mention that the temple is destroyed?
Yeah.
It's a-
Positive note.
But it wouldn't have necessarily mattered to early Christians per se, right? That the because they're already, yeah, as the video was saying, they're already kind of moving outward from the temple. So it would have been a significant event, not only for Judaism, it would have been significant for Christians too to see that the temple is being destroyed. But no, yeah, it's not recounted in Acts. Luke has hints that the temple has been destroyed, but we'll talk about that next summer. So you'll have to wait.
Next summer. Okay.
We'll do Luke's gospel next summer, so we're doing these in reverse order. Any questions on this timeline? That is a super brief timeline. In a sense, it shows the Gospels cover 1 year of time. Like Luke's Gospel is 1 year of time, let's say, from start to finish, give or take. Acts goes from the early 30s to the early 60s. So it's like a 30-year swath of time. So there's a lot of history that starts to get recounted across its 28 chapters. Here's just a brief, I know this is a very exciting day, introductions and all. Here's a brief outline of Acts. Part 1, Peter's ministry, the first 12 chapters. Part 2, Paul's ministry, starting with chapter 13 and going to the end of the book. I don't think we need to say much more about that. It's presence in worship. How does this show up on Sunday mornings? If you go to the top of page 4, I think I'm about the only one who finds this interesting, but I'm going to make you suffer through it anyway.
You're not alone.
Here are all the readings that show up across the 3-year cycle of readings that we use here at East Union. I think I give a percentage of what it is. 19% of the book of Acts gets read on a Sunday morning across 3 years. That seems low, but again, and no offense to the second half of Acts, right here. The second half of Acts is just travel log, so I don't think you can really read that on Sunday
When you
mornings.
say East Union, you mean the ELCA lectionary. That's what you
Yeah.
follow, right?
Well, a Protestant
It's not-
lectionary.
Protestant,
Yeah, it's not
right,
just
not
us.
East Union.
Correct, but West Union doesn't follow this, so that's why we,
Okay.
no, that's why I
Oh,
qualified.
the narrative lectionary.
Oh.
Yeah, not every church has to follow this lectionary. A lot of Protestant churches do. And Catholics, in a sense, follow it closely too. So about 20% of Acts is covered. If you haven't read all of Acts yet, do so, please. At least the first 15 chapters. You could maybe skip the second,
He
again.
did say please.
I did ask nicely if you could do that. You can skip the final 17 chapters if you like, though. Let's see, I kind of want to see that second video. We'll skip over issues at stake. You can read that at your own leisure. At the bottom of 5, yeah, the question was asked, is Acts recounting a type of history? It is, yes, but potentially, how do I say it at the bottom of 5 here? So toward the bottom of 5, I write that I believe Acts, yes, reports historical events, but yes, I also believe it does so through the lens of a Christian author. So Luke writes not only to recall history and tell us what happened, but he does also write to defend and advance the early Christian church. So if you've ever heard of the term an apologist, right, it's someone who is out to defend Christianity or something to that effect, and there's different types of apologists out there. So I think that Luke, yes, is writing to recount history and tell us what happened, but I also think he's writing to, in a sense, defend and advance the early church. So does that shade how he's writing about this history? Maybe a little bit. So I think you can take how Acts functions in one of 2 ways, just to say it broadly. You can take it as literal history, right? This is exactly what happened. That's perfectly fine. Or you can take it as this is, in a sense, Luke's take on how things happen through the lens of kind of his background as this Christian author, writing potentially to help defend and advance the Christian church.
But you could say that most of the Bible, or some of us would say that most of the Bible is literal history. I mean, you see literal history sprinkled in throughout all Old Testament and New Testament by identifying certain people of history at time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that maybe should be noted is that when scholars review what texts belong in the canon of Scripture, one of the things they look at is how much detail is there, and does that detail coincide with much of what they know of from the outside world, outside the Christian world, the Roman world, so to speak. And the book of Acts seems to have a lot of that attention to detail that makes it very historical in nature.
Sometimes too much attention to detail.
Sometimes.
Lucas, and he sometimes he almost tells us so much detail, historically speaking, that he almost makes problems for himself. So for instance, when did Jesus ascend back into heaven? He has, and we'll talk about kind of what ascension means, and that kind of helps us massage a potential problem. Luke's gospel ends with the ascension happening on the evening of Easter, right? On Easter evening, Jesus ascends into heaven. Luke starts off the book of Acts and says there's actually 40 days after Easter. We'll talk about how we can maybe understand what that word ascension means and kind of what Luke is getting after. That happens a couple other times with historical notes that he has, but I would say whether you take it as direct literal historical account or maybe part history and part shades of he's viewing this history through a particular lens. I'll leave that up to you. I did I quote from, I have it here. Toward the bottom of 5. Oh yeah, toward the bottom of 5. This was actually written at Catholics, but I included it here anyway because we're just Catholic light, so we're so close. Here we go. So toward the bottom of 5, I wanted to read this quote here about if we're supposed to take Luke like perfectly historically. It has often been asked how one can square such a skeptical attitude, I'm maybe kind of one of those skeptics, about the historical value of the Lucan writings with teachings about biblical inspiration, right? The Bible has been inspired by God. This is speaking directly toward Catholics, none of their ecclesiastical dogmatic documents, what a great phrase, which treat of biblical inspiration or the discussions of theologians who have sought to explicate this teaching have ever maintained that a necessary formal effect of inspiration is historicity. Biblical inspiration does not make history out of what was not such or intended to be such. The guarantee that is implied in biblical inspiration concerns truth. Now that's a big loaded word, but the truth that is involved is often not literal, but analogous and differs with the literary form being used. So there's poetic truth, there's rhetorical truth, there's even gospel truth, and that can all be apart from historical truth itself. So this is the author of one of the commentaries I used, writing toward their Catholic audience, and potentially writing to maybe some of us here. Right, so you can hold to that the Bible is inspired by God, but biblical inspiration does not necessarily mean that it has to be like a literal historical inspiration, right? It could just be that the writer is, what's guaranteed within the text is gospel truth. And I think I've mentioned that before, and I think it struck us strange that Catholics believe that the Bible is perfectly true in matters of salvation, right? That when it's speaking about, right, well, in a sense, the good news or the gospel message, so in matters of salvation, the Bible is perfectly true. But if Luke is just telling us like how much grass there was during the feeding of the 5,000, maybe he could have been slightly off by how many blades of grass he told us, because that has nothing to do with our salvation, right? So that's in a sense how Catholics kind of square what it means that the Bible has been inspired by God. And that can be the case too when Luke maybe gets himself into a little bit of a pickle when he's describing, like say when Jesus is born and he's telling us who's in charge. Sometimes the dates are a little bit wonky, but that has nothing to do with our salvation. So again, it's kind of up to you as to how you want to square what biblical inspiration means. But it does not necessarily mean like perfectly true in every single word. It can if you wanted to, but that's not necessarily what it has to mean.
You may have answered this already, but I know that we are making an assumption that this was written by one human being, rather than, could it have been a number of people sitting? And that's why there seems to be this other variation that, could it have been that one person wrote about this, let's say Luke,
Mm-hmm.
wrote about what he felt is important, and other people were saying, well, it's important to include these stories. And Luke would say, well, then you go write that story, and we'll include it in the finished product.
Yeah. That's possible. So at the very start of Luke's gospel, right, he says that he's investigated everything. So he talks about having sources that he uses. So in the later half of Acts, when Paul is out traveling with his missionary journeys, for verses at a time, suddenly the narrative slips into using the word we, and it'll say, we went and did something. We can think of that in two ways. You could think of it as suddenly, like the author himself is present in those moments, and he's just kind of naturally writing, well, we went to Ephesus or Corinth, or we went to the temple and Paul preached. Or it could be that he is using another written source. So maybe it's a diary or a travelogue that someone else has written that said, well, we went here and did this thing. And since Luke has told us that he's gathered together all these sources, maybe in those instances, he's just quoting verbatim from a source that just happened to have the word we in it. There are particular sections of Acts that seem to have more like Aramaic or Jewish flavor to them per se. And so again, are these sources that are stemming from more of the Jerusalem, Palestinian like area of Israel, and he's just then incorporating it into his work? Certainly, right? Because he's told us out loud that he is using all the resources at his disposal, right? We know in a sense that, that Luke used the Gospel of Mark, right? It's kind of a starting point for his gospel. I think he potentially used Matthew's gospel too, right? He's using all of these different sources. So we might think of it as more of a patchwork quilt that he's put together.
And that was based upon our conversations in previous studies, authorships of certain books of the Bible, based upon what we know now, there may be some question of, did Timothy actually write? And so that certainly doesn't change our view of what was written, but it certainly makes sense.
Good. Let's see here. Yeah, Acts is this, let's see here, I'm in the middle of page 6, then we'll wrap up here. We've mentioned this, yes, Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, which is unfortunate with how the New Testament has been ordered. I forget exactly how it, whoever ordered the New Testament did so in a way that gives a disservice to Luke and Acts. John's Gospel is wedged right in between them, right? If we were going to reorder them, I suppose I would reorder them such that Acts follows the book of Luke, right? Because they're like 2 volumes of one work. So John's Gospel just kind of gets in the way and breaks it up and makes it seem like Acts is this whole different author, a whole different story. No, Acts is just a continuation of Luke.
Isn't that partly because John is written after Luke? So if you're gonna put them in any kind of chronological order,
The
Matthew,
Gospel,
Mark, Luke, John, of course, that doesn't work either.
because
because
Mark is thought to
should
have been
be at
written
the beginning.
first.
So it's tough.
Or maybe because
It's just
John
harder to
is so
say
different
Matthew, Mark,
than
Luke,
the
John. Let's get
3 other Gospels
John,
too.
Luke. Just
Yeah.
Matthew, Mark, Luke are
Or Jude,
fairly
Mark.
similar
I
in
would say
style and
Matthew,
so
Mark,
forth,
John,
and
yeah.
John, we'll
Yeah.
just put him at the end because he's so different. Or the style.
I forget how the Gospels were ordered. I think it was always thought that Matthew was written first, and so that's why he gets put first. And he was typically the one that most people liked, I think, was Matthew's Gospel.
Well, it has Jewish flavor, so.
There's a lot of Jewish flavor to it. Absolutely. Okay, and then, yeah, concluding thoughts, you can read those on your own. Let's see, on page 7, just to wrap us up here, because maybe you're not a reader. Maybe you don't want to spend 10 weeks in the book of Acts, and this is just going to be awful for you. I like things like this at a minimum, even if you do like spending 10 weeks in Acts. I just kind of want to be able to see in 30 seconds just tell me all 28 chapters in one single page. Well, there you go. 28 chapters in one single page. So if you read this, you'll have, in a sense, understood the whole of the book of Acts.
See you in 8 weeks.
That's fine. If you want to bail on us, if you want to bail for the next 8 weeks, you will not hurt. Will not hurt, cannot hurt my
Can you
feelings.
say that out loud?
Okay, we'll wrap it up right there. Maybe next week we'll come back and watch the video that has the second half of the book of Acts, just to say that we can, that we did it and we saw it. Any final thoughts or questions or wonderings on the book of Acts?
So, my issue
Yep.
is that if these were written in Greek to begin with, you have other scholars, other people that come and say, okay, well, now we need to take it from the language it was written in and interpret it into a language that we know.
Yep.
How many and how often have those interpretations happened to where the stories that we are reading weren't necessarily actual events that took place? They were misinterpreted. And through the interpretation, we get a story that maybe wasn't necessarily the exact way that it happened or the original version.
Do you have a particular like story or event in
No,
mind?
it's the.
Just in general?
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
agree with
I
you,
mean,
Val.
you know, I've often wondered
Yeah.
what, you know, because before I became a Christian, I didn't understand how if we were worshiping one God, why are there so many religions? And the priest that I went to said, if you put 12 people in a room and you tell them a story, and those 12 people come out and you ask them individually what they heard, you're going to get 12 different stories. And so that made sense to me. But it also means that I question what is by the time it reaches English, how close to that original truth are we actually receiving?
Well, how close to the truth are we, in a sense, stems down to faith, right? Like we believe that God has kept the truth there. It's not necessarily like a game of telephone, I don't think, right? Because it's just going from Greek to English.
But didn't it go through Latin before it went?
It gets
into-
so the Greek does get translated into Latin around like the 4th or 5th century. What's called the Vulgate, that becomes the Bible of the Catholic Church for 1,000 years, right? This Latin translation. So our English translations are not coming through that Latin one. They're coming through like that manuscript I showed you on the back of the handout for today, right? We're going back to, in a sense, the oldest Greek manuscripts that we can find. Now there might be questions on what the particular Greek words mean, or what, especially with Hebrew, there's many Hebrew words that only show up 1 or 2 times in the Old Testament, and it's so ancient that we kind of just have to take an educated guess as to what they mean. They don't necessarily affect our salvation. But I would say that's maybe the closest we get to the strange game of telephone, where a Greek word shows up and we just can't quite figure out, like it gets used 1 time in the New Testament, and it doesn't necessarily get used in the 1st century. Oh no, like what did that mean? Like if you have a King James version, the word unicorn shows up in the Old Testament. Not like a mythical like unicorn that we think about, but maybe like a rhinoceros or something, right? So certainly words change over time, but I would say that for the most part, when we have these narratives and stories, I don't think they've necessarily encountered malfeasance with a quote-unquote interpretation. If you have like a paraphrase Bible, like the Message, there I would say there's probably, it's doing some of the interpreting for you. Most Bibles are going to be more of a word for word translation where they're just trying to actually pull the text from Greek into the English. So I wouldn't be too concerned that we've kind of played this game of telephone and it's completely.
The reason I bring this up is because one of the issues that I have, I choose to look at the Bible as a learning tool. You know, that I
Yeah.
believe that it was a gift handed down for me to learn how to be the best person that I could be. The problems that I have is when people use the Bible literally for their cause. And it's like, that's the issues that I have. And it's like, at what point do we take literally to bring into our lives to move forward and be a good person? And what do we use as just a tool to say that may not have necessarily happened, that may not have been the words that were said, but it still means I still need to be a good person. But I have issues when people take specific words and use them for their specific cause. And so that's why I just have issues with that. That's why.
And that'll be person dependent, right, on how each of us kind of
Yeah.
look at the biblical text. And it's certainly not going to be able to, it's not something we can solve here as a group. But you're right,
Why
there's,
not?
yeah. But you're right, there are certain phrases that some of us take literally and love to take literally, and there are some phrases or stories or laws or commands that some of us happily do not want to take literally. And that will vary and change potentially for each of us, right? Like when Jesus says the rich can't get into the kingdom of heaven, we probably say, well, he must not be talking literally about that. Or we say, well, I'm not rich, so he's not talking about me. But then there might be other phrases where we say, no, we want to take this one literally because maybe it's good for us, but then maybe there's collateral damage out on the side.
And I guess, you know, we each can choose, are we gonna use the word, the Bible, as a hammer to hurt someone or a tool of love to love people?
Yeah.
And Jesus himself tells us to love. That is what, you know, we'll let God deal with everything else. We're to love. And coming from a person, I take most everything in there literally, but the thing that overrides all of that is love.
And the Greek has 4 different words for love.
Do I get to choose which one it is?
Only 4?
Oh, my.
That surprises me, it's only 4.
But I think one of the points when we look at scripture, we have to understand that most translations are very true to the language that is underneath that. And from a pastor's perspective, we're always trying to reach in and understand as best we can what the Hebrew or what the Greek is supporting that text that we're talking about. So I think you can look at, we have hundreds of different translations out there, so you can choose a lot of different ways of reading scripture, and much of it is very beneficial. I don't know that there's anything that is going to take you down a negative path in terms of a well-known or published translation of scripture at this point.
And I would encourage you to read many translations, right? Of varying,
Right.
a varying degree. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank
most-
you for letting me share that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're not the only one that feels that way.
Yeah.
Well, most good study Bibles have the Greek that you can look up as well, so, or the Hebrew, either way. So you can get as deep as you want to get.
Okay. Good. Well, the book should hopefully be here next week, and it'll be good to go.